I caught a stranger staring through my window on the third floor. I've always liked living on higher floors of buildings. There's something comforting about the distance between me and the busy streets below. I grew up in New York, where you kind of get used to the noise and chaos. But when I moved to Chicago a couple of years ago, I found an apartment that felt like my little escape from all of that. It's a small place, nothing fancy, but the view of the city from my third-floor window makes it feel bigger. The apartment building is old, but it's got character, and I've always felt safe here, until last year. It was a cold night in October when things started. I was lying in bed, scrolling through Instagram like usual, with my phone brightness turned all the way down. The apartment was quiet, and the only light in my room came from the faint glow of my phone. I remember glancing up at the window because something caught my eye. It was just a reflection, but it made me look closer. I didn't see anything unusual, so I shrugged it off and went back to my feed. I guess it's worth mentioning that my bedroom window faces a fire escape. The building next to mine is close, but not too close. Maybe a 10-foot gap between us, so I can't see directly into their windows, and they can't see into mine. Or at least that's what I thought. The next night, the same thing happened. I was lying in bed, my phone in hand, and something in the window caught my attention again. I remember sitting up, feeling a little weird about it this time, but still not seeing anything outside. It was dark, and I couldn't be sure if I was just imagining things. Maybe it was a shadow from something outside or some weird trick of the light. Whatever it was, it unsettled me enough that I pulled the blinds down and went to sleep. That's when things started to get strange. Over the next week, every time I got into bed, I had this nagging urge to look at the window. It was like my brain was trying to tell me something wasn't right. I convinced myself I was just being paranoid, so I didn't look. But the feeling stayed, gnawing at the back of my mind, making it harder to sleep. Then one night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had just gotten comfortable under the blankets when my phone buzzed with a notification. As I glanced at the screen, I saw a faint reflection again, like a shadow moving just beyond the glass. I froze, staring at the window, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My heart started pounding. I sat up slowly, squinting, my eyes adjusting to the darkness, and then I saw it. A face. A man's face, pressed against the window just beyond the blinds. It took a second for my brain to catch up with what I was seeing. For a split second, I thought I must be dreaming or hallucinating. But the longer I stared, the clearer it became. There was no mistake. Someone was outside on the fire escape looking into my window. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I was just paralyzed with this overwhelming fear. All I could do was stare back, hoping, praying that I was wrong. But the man didn't move. He just stayed there, staring at me from behind the glass, his face expressionless. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen in place, but eventually I forced myself to move. My hand trembled as I reached for my phone. I pulled the blanket up to my chin, trying to stay as still as possible while I dialed 911. My mind was racing. Who was this guy? What did he want? Was he going to try and break in? The operator answered, and I whispered as quietly as I could that there was someone on my fire escape. They told me to stay calm and stay on the line while they sent a patrol car. I stayed crouched on the bed, my eyes glued to the window. The man didn't move. He just stood there, watching. It felt like hours before I heard the sound of sirens outside. As soon as the flashing lights illuminated my street, the man disappeared. He didn't run, he didn't make a sound. He just vanished into the night. The police arrived shortly after, and searched the area, but they didn't find anyone. They checked the fire escape, and that's when they found it. A sleeping bag and a few empty food wrappers tucked away on the landing. He'd been living there, right outside my window, for who knows how long. The officers assured me they'd increase patrols in the area and keep an eye on things, but I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face staring back at me. I didn't know what he wanted or why he was watching me, but the thought of him being so close, so unnoticed, terrified me. The next day, I went to the hardware store and bought new locks for my windows, even though they hadn't been tampered with. I installed a set of heavy blinds too, ones that completely blocked out any light. I figured if I couldn't see outside, at least I wouldn't have to worry about someone seeing in. I tried to go back to my normal routine, but the fear never really went away. Every night, as soon as the sun went down, I would check the fire escape from behind the blinds, scanning for any sign of movement. I couldn't relax until I was sure no one was out there. A week passed, then two, and things started to feel normal again. I convinced myself that maybe it was just some homeless guy looking for a place to sleep and that the police had scared him off for good. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The way he stared through the window, so calm, so deliberate, it wasn't the look of someone desperate for shelter. It felt more like obsession. One night, I woke up to a noise. It wasn't loud, just a soft creaking sound like metal shifting under weight. My heart sank. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it toward the window. The blinds were down, but I could hear it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps on the fire escape. I didn't wait. I dialed 911 again, my hands shaking as I tried to stay quiet. I whispered to the operator that he was back, that I could hear him outside my window. They told me to stay on the line, but I couldn't. I hung up too scared to make a sound. The footsteps stopped, and I listened, holding my breath, waiting for something to happen. And then there was a knock. It wasn't a pounding knock, just a soft, almost polite tap on the window. My blood turned to ice. Who the hell knocks on a third-floor window in the middle of the night? I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. The knock came again, a little louder this time, followed by a low, raspy voice. It was muffled through the glass, but I could hear it clear enough. He was saying my name. I didn't wait for the police this time. I grabbed my coat and ran out of the apartment as fast as I could, down the stairs and out into the street. The cold night air hit me like a slap to the face, but I didn't stop running until I was a block away. I found a 24-hour diner and called the police from there, my hands still shaking. When they got to my apartment, they didn't find anyone. Again, no sign of forced entry, no sign of the man on the fire escape. But I knew he had been there. I heard him. I heard him say my name. That was the last night I spent in that apartment. I moved out the next day, crashing at a friend's place while I found a new spot. I didn't care about breaking my lease or losing the deposit. I just needed to get out of there. I haven't been back since. Looking back, I wish I had taken the signs more seriously. The reflections in the window, the weird feeling of something being off. It wasn't just paranoia. He was watching me for days, maybe longer, before I even realized what was happening. I still don't know who he was or what he wanted, and that's the part that scares me the most. There was no big dramatic conclusion, no moment where I figured it all out. He just disappeared, leaving me with nothing but questions and a lingering sense of dread that still follows me to this day. I moved to a new apartment on the other side of the city, this time on the ground floor. Ironically, it's in a busier area with more people around, and I feel safer here. But I can't shake the habit of checking the windows every night before I go to bed, just in case. I thought the weird smell in my apartment was bad enough, but what I found out about my neighbor was way worse. This happened a few years ago when I moved into a small apartment in Philadelphia. I had just landed a new job in the city and was excited to have my own place. It wasn't anything fancy. Just a one-bedroom in a pretty old building on the outskirts of Center City. The rent was cheap, which was a big deal for me since I was trying to save money, and the location was convenient enough for getting to work. Plus, the area seemed quiet and safe, which is all I really wanted at the time. The apartment was on the second floor of a 3-story building. My neighbor directly next door was an older guy, probably in his late 60s or early 70s. His name was Mr. Whitman. He kept to himself mostly, and we didn't really talk except for a few polite nods if we crossed paths in the hallway. He seemed nice enough, though, just quiet. I figured he was one of those lifelong city people who had lived there forever. A couple of weeks after I moved in, I started noticing this strange smell in the hallway outside my apartment. It wasn't overwhelming at first, just kind of musty or stale, like old food or something. At first, I assumed it was probably coming from the trash chute at the end of the hall. The building wasn't in the best shape, so I didn't think much of it. I figured maybe the trash wasn't getting taken out regularly, and the smell was wafting down the hallway. Over the next week or so, though, the smell got worse. It was this awful, pungent odor that just lingered in the air. Every time I came home from work and stepped out of the elevator, it hit me. It was strongest near Mr. Whitman's door, so I assumed it was probably coming from his apartment. Maybe he had some old food rotting in his place or wasn't taking his trash out. I don't know. I didn't want to be rude or assume the worst, so I just tried to ignore it. At one point, I remember mentioning it to the building super when I saw him in the lobby. He told me he'd look into it, but didn't seem all that concerned. I guess they figured if an old guy wasn't keeping up with his housekeeping, it wasn't really their problem. I wasn't going to push it any further, so I let it go. Then one day, about a month after I moved in, the smell got so bad I couldn't take it anymore. It was like a mix of rotting meat and something sour, and it was seeping into my apartment. I couldn't even sit in my living room without smelling it, and it made me feel sick. That night I remember sitting on my couch, trying to eat dinner, and I just couldn't stomach the food because the smell was so overpowering. The next morning I woke up, and the smell had somehow gotten even worse. I knew something had to be seriously wrong, so I called the landlord and complained. I told them it was coming from Mr. Whitman's apartment and that it had been going on for weeks. I was worried something might have happened to him, but I didn't want to go knocking on his door. It felt invasive, and honestly, I wasn't sure how to handle it. The landlord told me they'd send someone to check it out that afternoon. I went to work as usual, hoping they'd take care of it while I was gone. But the whole day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept imagining worst-case scenarios in my head, like maybe Mr. Whitman had gotten really sick or worse. I just had this sinking feeling that something bad had happened, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. When I got home that evening, the smell was still there, and it didn't seem like anything had changed. I hadn't heard from the landlord, so I assumed they hadn't been able to get in touch with Mr. Whitman. I knocked on his door once, just to see if maybe he'd answer, but there was no response. His apartment was completely silent. The next day, I called the landlord again and told them they needed to do something. I wasn't the only tenant complaining by that point. The whole floor smelled like a dumpster. Finally, they agreed to send someone with a spare key to check out Mr. Whitman's apartment. That afternoon, I was in my apartment when I heard the building super knocking on Mr. Whitman's door. I opened my door a crack to watch, hoping to get some answers. The super knocked a few more times, calling Mr. Whitman's name, but there was no response. Eventually, he used the key to unlock the door and went inside. I can still remember the look on his face when he came out a few minutes later. He looked pale, like he'd seen something awful. I heard him call the landlord and say they needed to call the police. My stomach dropped. I don't know why, but I just knew something was really wrong. The police showed up pretty quickly. They didn't give any details at first, but it wasn't long before they confirmed what I had feared. Mr. Whitman was dead. They didn't say how long he'd been there, but judging by the smell, it had been a while. I couldn't believe it. I had been living next to a dead man for weeks without knowing it. The thought made me feel sick, but that's not the worst part. A couple of days after they took Mr. Whitman's body out, I was still trying to process everything. I couldn't stop thinking about how long he had been in there and how no one had noticed. The smell, the silence. It all made sense now, but it still didn't feel real. Then, the landlord called me. They wanted to let me know that they had cleaned out Mr. Whitman's apartment, and that it should be safe to live next door again. They apologized for everything that had happened and told me that if I needed anything, I could reach out. I thought that was the end of it, but later that night, I overheard some of the building staff talking outside my door. They didn't realize I could hear them, but they were talking about what they had found in Mr. Whitman's apartment. One of them mentioned something about photos and how the police were still looking into it. That caught my attention. I didn't know what they were talking about, but I felt this weird sense of dread wash over me. What photos? I didn't find out until a few days later, when one of my neighbors filled me in. Apparently, when the police had gone through Mr. Whitman's apartment, they found dozens of photographs. Pictures of me. They were all over his walls, scattered on his coffee table, taped to his fridge. Photos of me walking into the building, sitting on my couch, cooking in my kitchen. Most of them looked like they had been taken through my windows. I couldn't believe it. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. How long had he been watching me? How had I not noticed? The thought that he had been sitting in his apartment taking pictures of me without my knowledge made my skin crawl. I tried to remember if I had ever seen him with a camera, or if I had ever caught him looking at me, but I hadn't. He had always seemed so quiet and unassuming. I had no idea he was watching me like that. It was like finding out you'd been living in a nightmare without even knowing it. The police came by to ask me some questions, but they didn't have a lot of answers. They said Mr. Whitman hadn't had any family or friends that they knew of, and there was no record of him ever being involved in anything criminal. They couldn't explain why he had been taking the photos, and since he was dead, there wasn't much they could do about it. They told me they were still looking into it, but I never heard anything more after that. I spent the next few weeks feeling completely unsettled. I couldn't stop thinking about those photos, about how long Mr. Whitman had been watching me. Every time I walked past his old apartment, I felt a shiver run down my spine. Even though he was gone, it didn't change the fact that I had been living next to someone who had been spying on me for who knows how long. Eventually, I moved out. I couldn't stand being in that apartment anymore, knowing what had happened. It felt like every time I looked out my window, I was half expecting to see someone staring back at me, camera in hand. Even though I tried to tell myself it was over, that Mr. Whitman was gone and couldn't hurt me, the feeling of being watched lingered. I don't know why he did it. Maybe he was just lonely, or maybe there was something darker going on. I'll probably never know. But even now, Years later, I still get a weird feeling whenever I think about that time in my life. It's like a reminder that you never really know what's going on behind closed doors. You never know who's watching. I caught my neighbor watching me for hours in the middle of the night, and what followed still freaks me out. This happened a couple of years ago, but I still think about it often, especially when I'm alone at night. I was living in a small town in Michigan at the time, not far from Ann Arbor. It was a quiet neighborhood, mostly families and older folks. Nothing ever really happened there. I liked it because it felt safe, predictable, and peaceful, exactly what I needed after moving around a lot for work. The house I was renting was on a cul-de-sac, and I had a pretty big front yard that faced the street. Across the road, there was this old, run-down house where a man named Mr. Crane lived. He was in his late 50s, maybe early 60s, and he lived alone. The house itself was in rough shape. Peeling paint, a sagging porch, windows that always seemed to have the curtains half closed. I never saw anyone else go in or out, and from what I could tell, he didn't have any family. At first, I didn't think much of him. I was friendly with most of my neighbors, and I would wave if I saw them outside, but Mr. Crane wasn't exactly the sociable type. He didn't participate in neighborhood barbecues or say hello when I walked by. Whenever I did see him, he was usually just sitting on his porch, staring at the street or working on something in his yard. He wasn't mean or anything, just kind of distant. I figured he was a private guy and I didn't want to bother him. A few months after I moved in, I started noticing something that made me a little uneasy. Whenever I'd be out in my yard, I'd get this strange feeling like someone was looking at me. I'd glance over, and sure enough, Mr. Crane's curtains would be slightly parted, just enough for me to see the glint of his glasses as he watched me from inside his house. It was never obvious, but it happened often enough that I started to feel uncomfortable. He never waved or tried to make conversation, just sat there, silently watching. At first, I tried to brush it off. People are weird sometimes, and maybe he was just bored or curious. It wasn't like he was doing anything aggressive. I figured as long as he stayed in his house, it wasn't that big of a deal. But as the weeks went by, it started happening more often. No matter what time of day I went outside, whether I was mowing the lawn, getting the mail, or just hanging out on my porch, those curtains would shift and I'd catch that glimpse of his face through the gap. It wasn't long before it started getting under my skin. I remember one evening in particular when I was having a couple of beers on my porch after work. It was a nice night and I was trying to relax, but when I looked across the street, I saw the curtains in Crane's house move, just slightly. He was watching me again, and for some reason this time it felt different. The fact that he never acknowledged me, never waved or came over to say hello, it made the whole thing feel more deliberate, more sinister. After that, I started avoiding going outside when I thought he might be home. It felt ridiculous, like I was overreacting, but I couldn't help it. The idea that he was watching me, even if it was from a distance, gave me the creeps. I even started closing my own curtains more often, just in case. Things took a turn one night, and it's something I'll never forget. I had been feeling on edge for a while because of the whole situation, so I decided to install a couple of security cameras around my house. I wasn't sure if I was being paranoid, but it made me feel a little safer. One of the cameras was pointed at my front yard and the street, so if anyone walked up to my house, I'd know about it. A few nights later, I woke up in the middle of the night for no reason. It was about 3 a.m., and everything was dead quiet. I usually sleep pretty well, so waking up like that was weird in itself. I got up to get a glass of water, and as I passed by the living room window, I glanced outside at the street. That's when I saw him, Mr. Crane. He was standing in his front yard, completely still, facing my house. The street lights cast this dim glow, and I could just make out his figure. He wasn't moving, wasn't pacing, just standing there staring at my house in the dead of night. My heart started racing. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I crouched down a little, trying to stay out of sight while I peeked through the blinds. I watched him for what felt like forever. But he didn't move. Just stood there, completely motionless, staring. At that point, I wasn't sure what to do. Calling the police felt extreme, but I didn't feel safe either. I decided to check the footage from my security camera. I pulled it up on my phone, and there he was, clear as day, standing in his yard facing my house. I rewound the footage to see how long he had been out there, and my stomach dropped. He had been standing there for over an hour. I don't know why, but that detail made everything so much worse. It wasn't just some passing glance or a weird coincidence. He had been standing in his yard watching my house for over an hour in the middle of the night. I sat there, staring at the footage, trying to figure out what to do. Part of me wanted to confront him, but another part of me was terrified. What if he wasn't just some harmless old man? What if there was something more going on? I didn't want to provoke him and make things worse. Eventually, I decided to wait it out. I kept watching from the window, heart pounding in my chest. After what felt like an eternity, he finally turned around and walked back into his house, disappearing behind those curtains. I stayed up for the rest of the night, too freaked out to sleep. The next day, I tried to convince myself that maybe I was overreacting, that maybe he had just been outside for some harmless reason, and it looked worse than it was. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. No one stands outside, staring at their neighbor's house for over an hour at 3 a.m. unless something is seriously wrong. After that night, I kept a close eye on Mr. Crane. I didn't see him outside during the day much, but every now and then I'd catch those curtains shifting, just enough for me to know he was still watching. The worst part was, I had no idea why. I had never done anything to him, never even really spoken to him. What was his deal? What did he want? A couple of weeks later, I came home from work one evening, and something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was this weird tension in the air. As I pulled into my driveway, I glanced over at Mr. Crane's house and saw that his curtains were wide open for the first time since I'd moved in. I froze for a second, staring at his house, trying to figure out what was going on. Then I noticed something even weirder. There were lights on inside his house, but I couldn't see him anywhere. Usually, if the lights were on, he'd be sitting by the window or somewhere in the living room, but this time, the place looked empty. I parked my car and sat there for a minute, debating whether I should go inside or maybe drive around the block to clear my head. But I was tired from work and just wanted to relax. So I went inside, locked the doors, and tried to forget about it. That night, I was in bed, watching TV, when I heard something outside. It wasn't loud, just a soft, scraping sound, like someone dragging something across the pavement. I paused the show and listened, trying to figure out what it was, but the sound stopped. After a few minutes, I went back to watching, figuring it was just some animal or the wind. Then I heard it again. This time I got up and went to the window, but I couldn't see anything in the dark. I opened my phone to check the security camera, and when the feed popped up, I felt a chill run down my spine. There was someone standing in my driveway. They were just out of the camera's direct view, but I could see a shadow on the edge of the frame. It was hard to tell, but it looked like they were standing near the side of my house, just out of sight from the window. My heart started racing again. I wanted to go outside and check, but something in my gut told me to stay put. I watched the camera feed for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the person to move, but they didn't. After a few minutes, I finally worked up the nerve to go to the door. I opened it slowly, peeking outside, but no one was there. The driveway was empty and the street was quiet. I don't know what I expected, but I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Maybe it had just been a trick of the light, or some random passerby. But then I turned to go back inside, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the ground, just outside my door, was a small piece of paper. I bent down to pick it up, and when I unfolded it, my hands started shaking. It was a handwritten note, scrawled in messy, uneven letters. It said, "I've been watching you." I don't know if it was from Mr. Crane, but after everything that had happened, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was connected to him. I stayed up all night again, watching the security footage and waiting for something else to happen, but nothing did. A few days later, I noticed that Mr. Crane's house was completely dark. No lights, no movement, nothing. It stayed that way for the next few weeks, and I didn't see him again. I asked a couple of the neighbors if they had heard anything, but no one seemed to know what had happened to him. Eventually, I moved out of that house. I couldn't take the constant unease anymore. Even though Mr. Crane was gone, I never felt safe there after everything that happened. I thought someone was messing with my garden, but it turned out to be much worse. A couple of years ago, I was living in a small suburban neighborhood just outside of Portland, Oregon. It wasn't a huge house, but it was perfect for me. One of the things I loved most about it was the backyard. It wasn't massive, but it had just enough space for a small vegetable garden. I wasn't some expert gardener or anything, but I really enjoyed growing my own veggies. Tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, stuff like that. It was a great way to unwind after work, and it made the place feel more like home. At first, everything was great. My garden was thriving, and I spent most evenings out there, watering plants and doing little chores. My neighborhood was pretty quiet, mostly families or older couples, and I felt really comfortable there. I wasn't super close with my neighbors, but we'd wave when we saw each other, and they all seemed nice enough. There was one guy, though, who I noticed every once in a while. He lived a few houses down, but I didn't know his name. He was in his 40s, kind of scruffy looking, and I rarely saw him outside. Every now and then, I'd see him walking his dog or smoking on his porch, but he never said much, just nodded if we made eye contact. I didn't think much of him. One morning, a few months after I moved in, I noticed something odd. A couple of my tomato plants had been uprooted, and some of my garden tools were scattered around the yard. At first, I thought maybe some animals had gotten into the garden. It wasn't a huge deal, so I fixed the plants, put my tools away, and didn't think much of it. But then it happened again the next day. This time my cucumber plants had been messed with, and there were weird little patterns in the dirt, almost like someone had dragged a stick through it. I was starting to get annoyed. My garden had been doing so well, and now it felt like I was constantly cleaning up after whatever was messing with it. I figured maybe a raccoon or some other animal had taken an interest, so I started looking into ways to keep them out. I bought some basic netting and put it around the plants, hoping that would solve the problem. It didn't. Over the next few days, more things in the garden were messed with. Plants were pulled out of the ground, tools were moved, and there were more of those weird patterns in the dirt. It was like someone, or something, was deliberately messing with my garden. I was getting pretty frustrated at this point. I even joked with a coworker that it felt like some neighborhood kid was sneaking into my yard just to annoy me. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The way the plants were being disturbed, it didn't feel random. It felt purposeful. One morning I went outside to find that it had escalated. Not only had several plants been completely uprooted, but there was also something new. A small meal laid out neatly on the table I kept near the garden. It wasn't just a random assortment of food either. It was a fully made salad, using ingredients from my garden. Tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, all freshly picked and arranged on a plate. Next to it was a fork, which I recognized as one from my own kitchen. I stood there staring at the plate, trying to process what I was looking at. My heart was racing, and I felt this weird mix of fear and confusion. Who the hell had been in my yard using my vegetables, and worse, going into my house to get a fork? I hadn't noticed anything missing inside, but the idea that someone had been in my house without me knowing was terrifying. I decided to get some cameras. I wasn't sure if I was just being paranoid, but I needed to know what was going on. I set up a couple of cheap security cameras that covered most of the backyard, including the garden and the door to my house. I hoped that would give me some peace of mind. For a few days, nothing happened. The garden stayed untouched, and there were no more weird meals or signs of intrusion. I started to relax a little, thinking maybe whoever had been messing with my stuff had gotten bored and moved on. But then one night, I got the answer I was dreading. I woke up around 2 a.m. because my phone buzzed. I had set the cameras to alert me if they picked up any motion, and when I checked the notification, I saw that there had been activity in the backyard. My heart started pounding as I opened the app to look at the footage. There, in the dim light of the backyard, I saw someone moving around the garden. It was hard to make out their face, but they were wearing dark clothes and crouching down, picking vegetables. They moved slowly, almost methodically, like they knew exactly what they were doing. After a few minutes, they stood up and walked over to the table where the previous meal had been left. I watched as they carefully arranged the vegetables on a plate, then took a small container out of their pocket and added some kind of dressing. But the worst part, as they set the plate down, they turned slightly, and I recognized them. It was my neighbor, the scruffy guy I had seen a few times, the one who lived a couple of houses down. I felt sick. He had been the one messing with my garden this whole time, and worse, he had clearly been in my house before, taking my cutlery to use for these bizarre little meals. I sat there, staring at the footage, not sure what to do. I didn't want to confront him directly. I didn't know what he was capable of. And the fact that he had already been in my house without me knowing made me feel incredibly vulnerable. I decided to call the police the next day. When the police came, I showed them the footage, and they took it seriously, which was a relief. They said they'd talk to the guy and file a report, but they couldn't do much unless he actually tried to break into my house again. They told me to keep an eye on things and let them know if anything else happened. After that, I didn't see much of the guy. I think the police visit must have spooked him, because for a while my garden stayed untouched. I still felt on edge, though. Every time I went outside, I found myself looking over at his house, wondering if he was watching me. I double-checked the locks on my doors and windows every night, just in case. But then, one evening, just when I was starting to think the whole ordeal was behind me, I found something that completely freaked me out. I was cleaning up in the kitchen when I noticed one of my knives was missing. It was a big one, the kind you'd use for chopping vegetables, and I knew for a fact I had put it back in the drawer the night before. I searched the entire kitchen, thinking maybe I had misplaced it, but it was nowhere to be found. My mind immediately went to the worst-case scenario. Had my neighbor been inside my house again? Had he taken the knife for some reason? I checked the camera footage, but there was nothing from the past few nights. No signs of anyone coming into the yard or near the house. I couldn't figure out what had happened to the knife. but the idea that someone had taken it without me knowing was terrifying. I didn't sleep much that night. A few days later, the police followed up with me, saying they had spoken to the neighbor and that he denied everything. Of course, they didn't have enough evidence to arrest him or anything, but they told me to stay vigilant. I didn't know what else to do at that point. I just wanted to feel safe in my own home again. But that seemed impossible now. I kept the cameras up, checked them obsessively, and even considered getting a dog for extra security. But nothing could shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I hadn't seen my neighbor around much since the police visit, but I couldn't help feeling like he was still watching me somehow, waiting for the right moment to mess with me again. Then one morning, I went outside to water the garden and found something that made my blood run cold. There, on the garden table, was the missing knife, stuck into the wooden surface, blade down. It hadn't been there the night before. I was sure of it. I ran back inside and checked the camera footage, but there was nothing. No movement, no sign of anyone coming into the yard. It was like the knife had appeared out of nowhere. I called the police again, but by the time they arrived, the knife was the only evidence left. They filed another report and suggested I get a restraining order, but it felt pointless. Whoever was doing this clearly knew how to avoid the cameras, and the fact that they had returned the knife in such a creepy way made me feel like they were trying to send a message. After that, I couldn't take it anymore. I started looking for a new place, somewhere far away from that neighborhood. I never confronted the neighbor directly, and I never found out for sure if it was him who left the knife. But the whole experience left me feeling paranoid and on edge, like I was constantly being watched or stalked. I moved out a few months later and haven't looked back since. To this day, I still don't know what his deal was or why he was so fixated on my garden. But the thought of him creeping around in the middle of the night, messing with my things, and somehow avoiding the cameras still gives me chills. I just hope I never have to deal with something like that again. I thought my neighbor was just a harmless old man until I found out what he kept in his shed. A couple of years ago, I lived in a small town in Indiana, just outside of Fort Wayne. It was the kind of quiet suburban neighborhood where everyone pretty much kept to themselves. The houses were all close together, each with small yards separated by chain-link fences. I had moved there for work, renting a modest single-story house with a small backyard, and I was happy to have a bit of privacy. My next-door neighbor, Mr. Thompson, was an older guy, probably in his late 60s. He'd lived in the neighborhood for as long as anyone could remember, but I didn't know much about him. He was polite enough, but he mostly kept to himself. Every now and then, I'd see him in his yard tending to his garden or cleaning up his place, but we didn't talk much aside from a quick wave or a good morning when we crossed paths. He seemed like the typical old guy who didn't get out much. He never had visitors, and I never saw him leave the house for anything other than yard work or taking out the trash. The first thing that struck me as odd about him was his shed. It was this old, rusted thing in the back corner of his yard, tucked away behind overgrown bushes. From the first day I moved in, I noticed that it never seemed to be open. He'd be out in his yard a lot, but I never once saw him go into that shed. It was locked up tight, and the rusty padlock hanging from the door looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The whole thing seemed strange, but I didn't think too much of it. It wasn't really my business, and people are entitled to their own quirks. One day I got a closer look at the shed when Mr. Thompson asked me for help moving some old furniture. He was throwing out an old dresser and a few chairs, and since he was elderly, I offered to give him a hand. We carried the furniture to the curb, and afterward, I noticed the shed door was slightly ajar. It must have happened while we were moving stuff around, and before I could say anything, Mr. Thompson hurried over and shut the door tightly, reattaching the padlock as quickly as possible. I didn't say anything, but I couldn't help wondering what he was so concerned about. After that, the shed started gnawing at me. There was something about the way he reacted that didn't sit right with me. I found myself looking at it every time I was in my backyard. It became this weird fixation. I wanted to know what was inside, but I had no real reason to investigate. It was just an old man's shed after all. But still, there was something about it that felt wrong. A few weeks later, I had an excuse to get a closer look. I was out mowing my lawn when I noticed Mr. Thompson struggling to move a large bag of soil in his backyard. I shut off the mower and went over to help him. He thanked me, and as we were chatting, I casually mentioned the shed. I asked him what he kept in there, trying to sound as nonchalant as possible. He got this strange look on his face, something between annoyance and discomfort. He shrugged and told me it was just old tools and junk, nothing interesting. But the way he said it didn't feel right. His tone was too defensive, too quick to dismiss the question. I let it drop, but it only made me more curious. A few days later, I came home from work to find a police car parked outside Mr. Thompson's house. My heart skipped a beat as I watched the officers go inside, but I couldn't tell what was going on. They were in there for a while before they came out and drove off without saying anything to the neighbors. I didn't see Mr. Thompson for a couple of days after that, and I wondered if something had happened. I figured maybe he had fallen or gotten sick, and someone had called for a wellness check. Still, the whole thing made me uneasy. Not long after that, the curiosity got the better of me. I know it sounds ridiculous now, but the shed had been bothering me for weeks. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about it, and the police visit only made things worse. One evening, I was sitting in my backyard staring at the shed as usual when I noticed something strange. The padlock wasn't on the door. I hadn't seen Mr. Thompson go into the shed or leave his house all day, so I knew it wasn't him. Maybe he had forgotten to lock it. I know I shouldn't have done it, but I couldn't resist. I went over to the fence and glanced around to make sure no one was watching. Then, as casually as possible, I hopped over into Mr. Thompson's yard and approached the shed. The door was slightly open, just like it had been the first time I saw it, and the padlock was hanging loosely on the latch. My heart was pounding, and I almost turned back, but I had come this far, so I pushed the door open. Inside, it was dark and smelled damp, like the shed hadn't been aired out in years. There were shelves lining the walls, cluttered with old tools and jars of nails and screws, just like Mr. Thompson had said. For a moment, I felt relieved. It really was just an old man's shed, filled with useless junk. I was about to leave when something caught my eye. On one of the shelves, there were stacks of photographs, neatly arranged in piles. I picked one up, my hands trembling slightly. It was a picture of me. I stared at it, my mind racing. It had been taken from outside my house, probably through one of my windows. I flipped through the stack. There were more pictures of me, in my backyard, in my living room, even in my bedroom. My stomach turned. I had no idea how long he'd been taking these, or how I hadn't noticed before. I backed out of the shed, feeling like I was going to be sick. But as I turned to leave, something else caught my eye. On the far wall, there was a corkboard covered in more photos. These were different. They weren't just of me. They were of other people in the neighborhood. Families, couples, kids. He had detailed notes scrawled next to each one, listing their daily routines, when they left the house, when they came back, when their kids went to school. It was like he had been tracking everyone for months, maybe years. I stood there, staring at the corkboard, my mind racing. Why would he do this? What was the point of all these pictures and notes? My skin crawled at the thought of Mr. Thompson watching me and everyone else, knowing our schedules, our habits. The fact that he had been in my yard, near my windows, taking pictures of me without my knowledge, it made me feel violated in a way I can't even explain. I knew I had to leave before he came back, so I quickly slipped out of the shed and back into my own yard. My hands were shaking as I locked my door behind me, my mind still reeling from what I had seen. I didn't know what to do. I thought about calling the police, but part of me was terrified that if I did, Mr. Thompson would find out and come after me. The way he had been secretly watching the entire neighborhood made me feel like he was capable of anything. That night I barely slept. Every noise outside made me jump, and I kept imagining him standing outside my window, watching me like he had been for who knows how long. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay in that house anymore. I packed a bag and went to stay with a friend for a few days while I figured out what to do. I wasn't going to take any chances. When I finally got the courage to go back to my house, I avoided Mr. Thompson completely. I didn't speak to him, didn't look at him. I went out of my way to make sure we didn't cross paths, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew I had been in the shed. It was like there was this unspoken tension between us, even though he never said anything to me about it. A few weeks later, Mr. Thompson's house went up for sale. I don't know if he moved because of me or if it was just a coincidence. But when he finally left, I felt a huge sense of relief. I never did report what I found in his shed. Looking back, I wish I had, but at the time, I was just so freaked out that I didn't want to get involved. Maybe I was scared of what the police might find, or maybe I was just trying to move on from the whole thing. I still live in the same house, but I've installed cameras and reinforced all the locks. Every once in a while, I catch myself glancing over at the empty lot where Mr. Thompson's house used to be, wondering if anyone else ever found out what he was really up to. It still gives me chills to think about how close he was to me, how long he had been watching without me even realizing it. Sometimes, when I'm in my backyard, I get this uneasy feeling like I'm being observed from somewhere just out of sight. And every time I think about that corkboard, those photos, and how easily we can live next to someone without really knowing them at all. I found a hole in my ceiling and realized my neighbor had been watching me for months. I've never shared this before, but I still think about it sometimes, and it really messes with my head. This happened about 2 years ago when I was living in Chicago. I had just moved into a small one-bedroom apartment in Logan Square. The building wasn't anything special, just a basic 3-story walk-up, but the rent was cheap, and it was close enough to the Blue Line to make my commute manageable. The apartment itself was fine, a little rundown maybe, but it had everything I needed. I wasn't picky. I was working long hours and wasn't home much, so I wasn't looking for luxury. Just a place to sleep, really. The walls were thin, and I could hear my neighbors sometimes, but that's normal in old buildings, right? I could hear the guy upstairs pacing around at night, and sometimes he'd be talking loudly. It was annoying, but nothing I couldn't live with. The man who lived above me was a middle-aged guy, probably in his late 40s or early 50s. I never really interacted with him beyond a nod if we passed each other in the stairwell. He wasn't super friendly, but he didn't seem aggressive or anything, just kind of weird. He always had this disheveled look, like he never left the apartment much. I figured he was a bit of a loner, but that's not exactly unusual in a big city. For the first few months, everything was pretty normal. Sure, there were times when his pacing at night would keep me up, but I didn't think much of it. People have weird schedules, especially in the city, so I just wrote it off as him being a night owl. But over time, I started noticing that his late-night pacing seemed to get more frequent, and he'd talk to himself loudly enough that I could hear it through the ceiling. It started to feel more like he wasn't just talking to himself. He was having full-on conversations like there was someone else up there. But I never heard another voice. It was just him, mumbling or sometimes yelling. One night I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of something in my bathroom. At first, I thought it might be the pipes. They'd bang every now and then. But this was different. It was like a soft scraping sound, like something rubbing against the walls. I got out of bed to check, but by the time I got to the bathroom, the sound had stopped. Everything looked normal, and I didn't see anything out of place, so I just went back to bed. But over the next few weeks, the noises started happening more often. Always at night, always around the same time. Scratching, scraping, and sometimes it sounded like something was shifting above me, like something moving in the ceiling. It started to freak me out, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe there were rats in the walls or some other animal. This was an old building after all. I thought about calling the landlord, but I figured they wouldn't do much, and I didn't want to be that tenant who complained about every little thing. Then one night, I was taking a shower when I noticed something weird. There was this small discoloration on the ceiling right above the shower head. At first, I thought it was water damage, which wouldn't have been surprising in a place like that. But when I looked closer, I realized it wasn't a stain. It was a tiny, almost perfectly round hole. My stomach dropped. I stared at it for a few seconds, trying to make sense of it. It didn't look like an accident. It looked deliberate, like someone had drilled it. The hole was small, just big enough that you wouldn't notice it unless you were really looking. I felt a wave of unease wash over me, but I tried to convince myself that it was nothing. Maybe it was an old nail hole or something from when the building was being renovated years ago. But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the hole. I kept imagining someone on the other side of it, watching me, listening. The thought made my skin crawl. The next morning, I got a ladder and took a closer look. The hole went all the way through the ceiling. I couldn't see anything on the other side, but it definitely wasn't just an old nail hole. It was too clean, too precise. I tried to brush it off, but the more I thought about it, the more paranoid I got. I started noticing other weird things around the apartment, like little scuff marks on the walls near the ceiling, and a few places where the paint didn't quite match. It was subtle, but once I noticed it, I couldn't unsee it. It was like someone had been tampering with the ceiling. I finally decided to confront my landlord about it. I called and told them about the hole, the noises, and the weird pacing upstairs. They brushed it off, saying that old buildings have quirks, and that the guy upstairs was probably just a little eccentric. They promised to send someone to check for water damage, but I could tell they didn't think it was a big deal. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that hole, and the idea that someone might have been spying on me. I tossed and turned for hours, and finally, sometime after midnight, I heard it again. That soft, scraping sound, like something moving in the ceiling. This time, I wasn't going to ignore it. I got out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and went into the bathroom. The hole was still there, and for a second, I felt ridiculous standing there in the middle of the night with a flashlight, staring at my ceiling. But then I heard something. A faint, almost imperceptible noise like a breath. My heart started racing. I shone the flashlight up at the hole, and for just a split second I saw it, something in the hole, something moving. I froze. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. I backed out of the bathroom slowly, keeping my eyes on the ceiling, and grabbed my phone. I didn't know what to do. I thought about calling the police. But what would I even tell them? That there was a hole in my ceiling, and I thought I saw something move. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I knew I couldn't stay in the apartment that night. I ended up crashing at a friend's place, and the next morning I called my landlord again, demanding that they come and take a look at the ceiling. This time, they sent someone over. The maintenance guy came, took a quick look, and said it was probably nothing. Just some old wiring or something. I tried to press him about the hole, but he brushed it off, saying it was just an old building and there were bound to be quirks. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the unease. I started noticing more weird things around the apartment. Small details I hadn't paid attention to before. Little scratches on the walls, tiny holes in the corners of the ceiling. It was like the more I looked, the more I found. I started to feel like I was being watched, like there were eyes on me whenever I was in the apartment. The noises continued at night, and I was barely sleeping anymore. Every time I heard that soft scraping or shifting, I would lie there, wide awake, my heart pounding, waiting for something to happen. I couldn't live like that. One night, I finally decided to take matters into my own hands. I had to know what was going on. I grabbed my ladder and a screwdriver and went back into the bathroom. My hands were shaking, but I started unscrewing the vent cover in the ceiling. As soon as I got it off, I saw it. Another hole, much larger than the first, leading straight up into the ceiling. I shone my flashlight into the hole, and my heart nearly stopped. There, tucked away in the shadows, was a small camera. It was positioned just right, angled down into my bathroom, hidden so well that I never would have noticed it unless I had been looking directly for it. I felt sick. Someone had been watching me. Not just from the hole, but with a camera. I didn't know how long it had been there or who had put it there, but I had a pretty good idea. The guy upstairs. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my phone, took pictures of the camera, and called the police. They came over, took a statement, and started an investigation. They searched the guy's apartment, and sure enough, they found more cameras, dozens of them. He had been spying on me, and who knows how many other tenants for months, maybe even longer. It turns out the guy had drilled several small holes throughout the building, placing hidden cameras in various apartments. The police said he had some kind of setup in his apartment where he could watch the footage in real time. It made me sick to think about how long he had been watching me and what he might have seen. The landlord tried to play dumb, claiming they had no idea what was going on, but I wasn't buying it. There had been too many complaints from other tenants about weird noises and issues with the building, and they had done nothing. I ended up breaking my lease and moving out as soon as I could. Even now, I can't go into a bathroom without checking the ceiling, making sure there are no holes or hidden cameras. It's terrifying to think about how easily someone can invade your privacy without you even knowing. It's something I'll never forget.